Carmine Puleo. The correct pronunciation is really Puleo. Everybody over the years has called me Puleo. But recently I took a couple of trips to Europe, and I visited and made acquaintance with my family. I have family there. And I learned that the correct pronunciation is Puleo. So now, in these last few years, I go around telling everybody the name is really Puleo rather than Puleo.
Now,
but really, everybody knows me as Puleo.
Yeah, but no, this is as a result of your visiting family where?
In Italy.
Where in Italy?
And most of them are in Sicily, but I have a lot of relatives scattered throughout Italy. I have some in Rome, some in Foggia, some in different parts of Sicily. So they're scattered around.
Is the name? I'm curious because I've never been aware of that myself. That the pronunciation of it was on a different syllable.
Yeah.
Is that a place in Sicily, or is it just a?
No, I think that is probably, and I suspect anyway, but I have no evidence of it, and I never really did any thorough research on it. But my suspicion and what I gathered was is derived from the name of Palermo and Petria, which is meaning rock.
Yes.
So I think it's a combination of Palermo and Petria, and somehow or other it was derived from those two.
Very interesting. Now, Carmine was whose name in the family?
Well, actually, that's an interesting story too. In the Italian culture, usually the first son is named after the grandfather on the paternal side, and the first daughter is usually named after the grandparent on the paternal side.
On the paternal side?
On the paternal side. So it would be my father's father, for example, whose name was Carmelo. And my baptismal name, or my birth certificate, really reads Carmelo.
I'll be damned.
And not Carmine. But somehow or other over the years when I went to school, because my folks were immigrants, and as a matter of fact, I didn't learn to speak English until the early years of elementary school. My first language was really Italian. So that when we got to the, finally enrolled in the elementary school in New York City, somehow or other, the records showed up as Carmine rather than Carmelo.
For goodness sake.
And so from the record that appeared in the schools in those days, being Carmine, the name Carmine kind of stuck.
And you were born here.
I was born here, yeah.
And your parents survived the Ellis Island experience, or rather, the name change danger that it could occur there. But you hit the public schools and experienced it.
Yeah, so they kind of picked up that name Carmine, and we stayed with it. And then not too long ago, as a matter of fact, just before my retiring, I legally changed the name to Carmine because all of my documents and everything that I needed to do was really in the name of Carmine. So rather than to avoid any kind of conflict or problems,
absolutely,
I legally changed it to Carmine.
But
really, it's Carmelo.
Carmelo.
Yeah. Well, my grandfather.
Carmelo Puleo.
Yeah.
Where did the nickname first take?
Which is what? Chuck?
Chuck.
That's that I got from the service when I was serving in the Army. I was in the 101st Airborne Division at the time during the Korean War. And I guess in the United States we have, a pluralistic society, and I encountered and met a lot of people who didn't know too much about Italian names such as Carmine or Carmelo. And so they had difficulty pronouncing the name Carmine. And somehow or other, somebody came up with Charles, and eventually it evolved into Chuck. And I was playing a lot of ball in those days too, and then I did some boxing, and then I took the name of Chuck while I was doing some boxing. So,
all right.
So the name Chuck then kind of stood. And my wife, of course, met me as Chuck, and has been Chuck pretty much ever since.
Okay. Now, your family situation at present is what?
Well, I have 4 daughters, all college graduates. My oldest girl's name is Stephanie, has received her doctorate, and she's a professor at the University of Florida at the graduate school there. Matter of fact, this will be her last year there. She's accepting an assignment in a school at the University of Alabama.
What does she teach?
She's in the counseling and psychology. Her specialty is counseling, but psychology is the general. I have my second daughter, whose name is Marie Lenore, and she's a financial analyst down in Wall Street area. She's doing quite well. My third
Does
girl,
she commute, Chuck? Does she commute?
she lives in Westchester County.
Okay.
In Upper Westchester County in the town of Somers, and she commutes back and forth to work. And of course, she comes out and spends some time with us after work occasionally. Comes out about once every couple of weeks anyway. She has 2 grandchildren, and they, of course, spend a lot of time with us too. And they come visit us, and we visit them.
What are that's her children? What are the
her children? Their ages are 4 and 8. A boy, 8 years old, and a girl, 4 years old.
Okay.
My third girl, his name is Karen. And she's in business for herself, and she manufactures jewelry. And she has a manufacturing plant in the Dominican Republic.
Wow.
So I don't get to see her too much. She's back and forth to the Dominican Republic a lot, back and forth. And she's surviving in her business, but she's having a lot of competition in the business. So I don't know how long she's going to stay in that business, but currently anyway, she's in the manufacturing business, jewelry, good jewelry, not costume jewelry. And my youngest girl, who's Teresa, is an attorney, and she's an attorney up in Albany. They're working for a national law firm where she's on track to become a partner there too as well.
Oh, you got to be very proud.
Yeah, I am. They're good.
Wow.
And I think each one of the kids, I hope anyway, that they picked up on one of the things that I always kind of talked a great deal about in terms of a philosophy of life, and that is the pursuit of excellence. I think you've always heard me talk about
Absolutely.
Pursuit of excellence, and I think the things that I've said about that have encouraged them to actually pursue excellence. They've got good work ethics, and they hold themselves accountable to themselves.
And very different in terms of their talents and their paths.
Yeah, it's interesting too.
The creative on the one side and the legal on the other, and business, all base, and education, covered all bases.
Yeah, very interesting that they took the various interests, and each one of them have their own little talent, and each one's different.
There must be a piece of you there someplace in each one of those interests, or is there something that you don't see yourself as having a?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, all the parents, all of us, have tremendous influence on our children. Yeah. And our children have, no matter who they are, will always try to imitate the parent, because there's tremendous influence that parents have on them.
Or there's a great gene pool there that comes to them from previous generations on your wife's side of the family too. So there's a lot to draw on.
Of course. Yeah.
Where is home for you? Where are you living?
I live in Lindenhurst, Long Island. And right now I'm known as a snowbird, in which after Christmas, my wife and I, we have a place in Boynton Beach, Florida. And after Christmas, we go down to Boynton Beach. And we usually stay there until after Easter time. And after Easter is the guiding period during the year that will help determine when we're returning back to Long Island. But we wouldn't give up Long Island. We don't intend to give up Long Island. We like it. I think pretty much our life is here. But we go there to avoid the cold weather that we have up here. I guess as we get on in age a little bit, it becomes an obstacle to us.
Shoveling the snow.
Right? Shoveling the snow especially.
Yes. You are obviously then in Lindenhurst with your wife. What's your wife's name?
My wife's name is Teresa.
You've been married for a few years?
43 years. Matter of fact, we just finished our 43rd year last week, August 6th.
Great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Chuck.
Thank you.
Tell me about your wife. Describe her for me.
Well, I met Teresa while I was in the service. She was working for the government at the time. She was born and raised in the Brooklyn area. And she's of a family where there was 5 children. Teresa is, I guess, the best way to describe her, very much devoted to the family, very much so. And her biggest and highest priority is our children.
Mm.
And she's the type of a person that will make any kind of sacrifice for her children. And then, of course, I think she takes care of her husband quite well, too.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
Yes.
But she's a great mother, very much devoted to the children. Wonderful wife.
Where in Brooklyn was she from originally?
She's in the Park Slope area,
Uh-huh.
13th Street. I guess it was about 4th or 5th Avenue, somewhere in that area.
Okay, and when your folks lived in the city, where?
My folks came, and they, well, I was born and raised in New York City on 46th Street and 10th Avenue, which is the old Hell's Kitchen area.
Mm-hmm.
My father came here when he was young, and he lived pretty much in the same area. He was one of these kind of guys that tried to be a little bit of an entrepreneur. He worked first as a laborer and did a lot of, as most immigrants did in those days, and they came over and they took the less skilled type of employment.
He must have come around the 20s or...
In the 20s, as a matter of fact. And he was just about 20 some odd years old when he came.
Just in time for the Depression.
Yeah. So he came in the 20s. And he worked and he tried various businesses. He was married and his first wife passed away. And he was not married for a long time, but he made a trip back to the old country.
Mm-hmm.
And he met his old childhood sweetheart, I guess.
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
All right.
And they married and they came over.
Came back with a bride.
Came back with a bride. And as a matter of fact, my father was 50 years old when I was born. So
Really?
There was you talk about generation gap, there was a big gap. But
Wow.
we
You're a love child.
yeah, more or less. And there was a tremendous amount of love. I'm glad you brought that word up because I was their only child, but there was a tremendous amount of love and devotion for one another. Until to this day, and I think great about them constantly. I think about the things we've done together.
Yes.
That relationship is never gone. The love is still there. A lot of times, as a matter of fact, I look in the mirror when I go to shave in the morning. I say, "Hello, Pop. How you doing this morning?"
Yes.
I'm just reminding myself so much of my father. And I'm getting to that age that I remember him when I was young.
I assume from the way you're talking that Dad is no longer around.
No, he passed away back in 1974.
Mm-hmm. In the 70s?
67.
67. How old was he at that time?
77.
Okay. And Mom?
And my mother passed away in 72, and she was 84 years old at the time. She passed away. But anyway, they were immigrants. They came over, went to 46th Street and 10th Avenue. My father worked in the last few years, I recall, down at the docks as a longshoreman, and then because of his age, he started working as a security guard at the docks.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I was born and raised. As a matter of fact, everybody in those days worked down at the docks.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
If you, when you visited Italy and went back to Sicily and you talked to family, do you have a sense of the history of your father's family over there, what they were, what they did, how they made their living?
You know, it's mostly my mother's side. I'm talking about my father.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch to my
Yes.
mother in this case because my mother kept in touch with her side of the family. My father's family all came to this country, and there was really not much left.
I see.
In terms of family on my father's side, because my grandfather died when my father was a very young man. He died in an accident where he was, anyway. And so my father's side came over to this
Sure.
country.
for a fresh
But
start.
my mother was the only one from her side of the family that came to this country, so she kept tremendous correspondence with them, and they were a very close-knit family. But when my mother passed away in 72, even though they wrote to me, I was involved with a lot of things, raising my own family,
Sure.
very involved with my career. And I lost touch with being able to read and write in Italian.
Yeah.
And so I kind of gradually faded away from keeping in touch with them. So I had not been in touch with them for over 20 years. And then finally, when I decided to take a trip to Europe, and I didn't want to have to go there without trying to make some kind of contact with them, then I was able to make contact with them. And we renewed our acquaintances and friendship and love with one another.
Yeah.
And now, as a matter of fact, we're always constantly in touch with each other. We call each other up 2 or 3 times a month.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
So
terrific.
it's really close now.
What did your mother's family? What were her people doing when they were before they came to this country?
My grandfather was a barber over there in Italy. And in those days, he was also the dentist in it.
Yeah.
And the barber served as the local dentist, and he served as the local minor surgery type of things. You know, he was a jack of all trades, more or less.
Just like we read in the textbooks. That's the way it was.
Yeah.
With the red and white pole outside.
That's exactly right. That's the reason for that pole.
Yeah.
So he did that, and then, of course, my mother broke away when she married my father.
Yes.
It was interesting when I did take that trip to Italy. I went to visit the church where they got married, and I visited the place where they stayed for a while. And
That's got to be a wonderful feeling.
Great experience.
Sense of place.
You know your roots are, and it's
You
a
bet.
good feeling.
Yes.
You know where you are when you know your
Yes.
roots are.
I remember before you retired, you were talking about wanting to do this kind of thing.
Mm.
That's a dream fulfilled. Then.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Hell's Kitchen. You grew up on the west side of Manhattan. What are some of those earliest childhood memories
Well,
that you have?
it was really survival. You know, it was the whole area was rather low socioeconomic.
When were you born, Chuck?
I was born in 1930.
Okay, so your memories from the earliest memories would then be right in the midst of the worst depression we've ever had.
Sure. Yeah.
So when you say survival, I assume that some of the memories have to do with that period.
Oh yeah.
Economic survival.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who are not working, and survival to be able to put some food on the table. I can recall that my own folks were down and out, and how difficult it was for my father to go out there and do what he had to do to bring some food on the table just for the 3 of us. I was their only son, and there were people with larger families than me in the neighborhood, and probably even less fortunate than my folks were.
Mm.
So I'm saying survival in terms of economically. And I'm also talking about survival of the way your place is going to be in the world. So some different people took different routes in different directions. Most people in those areas, many of them unfortunately took the road to crime.
Yeah.
And crime was a way to survive. And I can understand that today with people who live in poverty.
Sure.
And it is a way of survival, unfortunately, through crime. So we have to address the whole situation.
I think you probably, a lot of the kids that you knew as a kid are no longer around for that reason, the choices that they made.
Yeah, many of them, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but many of them ended up, in prison, and some of them.
But your life and your choices and your decisions stand as testimony to you and to your family.
I probably consider myself one of the most fortunate people around, and incidentally, it's one of the reasons why I chose education as a career. In our neighborhood, we used to call it the block. What block did you come from?
Yep.
You came from Hell's Kitchen, but there was a block.
Territory.
And I was the only, I call myself kid, or the only child in my block, in my generation, that went beyond high school.
Really?
The only one in that block. I'm talking about hundreds of kids. And the rest, and I worked as a longshoreman too. I was there before going. For a long period of time, I worked as a longshoreman. But with a little bit of good luck, and I guess a lot of support from my mother and father, who pushed that I get education and tried, and well, they didn't push so much to get education, but they pushed me to read a lot and that kind of thing.
Yes.
And we got into various kinds of discussions. So there's an intellectual stimulation between the three of us, but at certain levels. I mean, it wasn't the intellectual stimulation wasn't so broad that we took in a whole lot in terms of politics and things that go on.
I
But
understand.
within a certain parameter, or I would say in environmental conditions.
Sure. Because the previous generation was also about surviving,
Sure.
I will hazard a guess that your father's education and your mother's education did not extend all the way through a formal.
No, my father didn't really have any education,
Mm-hmm.
and my mother, I think, finished what they call the I guess it would be equivalent to our junior high school.
Okay.
And she finished that. So she was the more educated of the two.
Uh-huh.
And she was probably the more intellectual of the two.
These are truly self-educated people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very much so.
So there's the role model that you had, and then you had the opportunity that you took advantage of.
Well, I also saw after a while that if you want to be liberated from the chain, if you want to call it that, the chains of poverty or the chains of a low socioeconomic level, the way to be liberated from that was really through education. And then when I finally went to college and I had to make a decision what I wanted to pursue, I decided that one of the things very interesting, I remember coming back from college. I went to LIU at Long Island University, and I used to commute back and forth by subway to the school, back and forth, but I would still be playing ball a lot with the guys in the neighborhood, basketball, baseball, and other things, including dice and gambling and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But whenever we would finish whatever activity we were involved with, we'd go out and have a beer or a soda or something, and we get into various kinds of discussion. And I was really very much impressed to realize how intelligent these guys were. I mean, they were streetwise, they were cunning, they know how to manipulate, but behind it all was a tremendous amount of native intelligence. What was lacking was the cultivation of that intelligence. And the way to cultivate that intelligence would have been through education, and unfortunately they didn't. But I realized that. I said, there are a lot of guys here that are a heck of a lot more intelligent than I am. And I'm getting a break because I went on a little bit beyond. I'm getting a little education, and I can see things opening up for me, and I can see myself breaking away from those chains of the poverty area. And I decided, dude, I'd like to help these guys, and I thought that perhaps the best thing I could do to help these guys would be to go into education. And if there wasn't these particular guys or their children, there were certainly other people like that in life, in our culture, in our society, that I could probably help as many as I can to liberate them to the point that they, through education, can have a lot of opportunities and choices that they can make to improve and enhance their quality of life. That's probably one of the reasons why I went into education. Probably, I know it's the reason I went into education.
Sounds like a statement of philosophy to me.
Yeah, I've been always committed to the whole idea of education as being the way in which people can improve their quality of life.
Chuck, besides your mother and your father, was there an adult or maybe a couple of adults that had a very profound effect upon those early years?
Yeah, there's one fellow particularly. I remember him. There was a little stationery store in our neighborhood, and there was a Jewish fellow by the name of Bernie. I remember Bernie. And I used to work for Bernie. in his store. In those days, they used to have these Coke machines. You have to put ice in the machine, in the box, and then you put your Coca-Cola and different kinds of soda. But they used to deliver these soda bottles, and you have to go down to the basement and bring it up. And then you have to do that, clean up the store and put the. So I still worked for him in a little stationery store. And this guy would every day preach something about life. And I think probably Bernie was a Marxist, to tell you the truth, because he was not a kind of a guy that got hung up on wealth for the sake of being wealthy. He knew that a certain amount of part, they used to deliver these soda bottles, and you have to go down to the basement and bring it up. And then you have to do that, clean up the store and put the. So I still worked for him in a little stationery store. And this guy would every day preach something about life. And I think probably Bernie was a Marxist, to tell you the truth, because he was not a kind of a guy that got hung up on wealth for the sake of being wealthy. He knew that a certain amount of wealth gave you the opportunity to make some choices of whether you're going to have a Chevrolet or a Cadillac or something of that nature. But I think he began to realize, and he began to influence me, that people in general are so important. And that no matter what's the situation you're in, whether you're born as a very poor person, or you're born with good fortune of a wealthy background, that each person is equally important, and each person is entitled to a certain quality in life. And that philosophy, I think, stayed with me and has been a tremendous influence to me for the rest of my life. So I think of Bernie very often.
How old would you have been when you worked with him? Were you a teenager?
Well, I was a teenager. Yeah, I was a teenager.
Okay.
Maybe about 15, 16 years old or something like that. I used to go get the newspapers for him and bring, that kind of stuff. But every day he always had some comment to make, and it reinforced this whole idea of people being important, and that we shouldn't look at and measure people based on the wealth that they might have, or even the talents that some people are born with. And as years went on, different things that I began to read about in my own philosophy kind of reinforced that and was endorsing his basic principle.
I started to ask you this before, and then we took another path. I want to come back to it for a moment. What's the earliest memory that you have? What's the earliest childhood memory?
I can remember, as a little kid, maybe I was 2 or 3 years old. I can remember we used to live on a top floor in a tenement house, And one of the things I can remember, even to this day, I think about it very often, is that somehow or other, my mother left the apartment to go next door, and I got out of bed, and I began to walk down the stairs in the tenement house. And by the time I got from the top floor, which is the 5th floor, to the 1st floor, one of the neighbors saw me.
Yes.
And I went into their house, and she put me in bed with her while she went and when she sent the husband out to go look, because I was crying. She sent the husband out to go look for my folks.
Yes.
And a couple of minutes later, my mother came in hysterical. She didn't know where I had been. So I can recall that. I don't think I was more than 2 or 3 years old. It's probably one of the earliest things I can remember.
You're saying you lived on the 5th floor of the walk-up tenement then?
Yeah, old railroad rooms. Yeah, the railroad. There was no heat in those,
Would that have been the first bedroom that you would remember, or would your memory?
I didn't even have a bedroom. We had what we called a railroad room. And it'd be the kitchen where you walked in, and then they called them railroad rooms because they were like railroad cars, one room after another, and you walk through each row, each room. So the second room was like a little dining area. And then the third room after that was my mother and father's bedroom. And in the fourth room is what we used to call the front room because it faced the street. And I had a convertible. So every night I would go to the front room, open up the convertible, and that's where I slept. But what was interesting is, in those days, there was no heat, and the only source of heat was a stove that was in the kitchen. And that stove that was in it was a combination where you cooking stove plus a coals. You used to go and get coal and make it heat from the coal stove. Well, the front room where I was freezing. So I can recall where...
No central heating.
No central. So I can recall, and suddenly I'm going to tell you something about central heating. That there's something else then. My mother used to take my pajamas or something and put it by the coal stove and heat them up. And I would get dressed in the kitchen by that stove and put on those warm pajamas, whatever it was. And I would run into the front room and jump into that bed, and I would sit. Before 5 minutes, I was freezing, and I could remember falling asleep every night, curled up like a little ball because it's always so cold. But then, gosh, that's the way it was. You got used to that.
This is pre-war, isn't it? We're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about you. I'm not talking about in the 50s. I started to say there was a situation occurred in our block, which there was, and subsequently legislation made in New York City where all of these tenement houses now had to have central heating. And the situation was, I remember very much, it was the Joe Louis and Muriello fight, Tammy Muriello. I remember boxes because I used to box him.
Yes.
And Tammy, Louis knocked him out in the first or second round, and the fight was over. And everybody went to bed early, went to sleep early. And it was, in those days, if you didn't have a coal stove, you had a kerosene stove.
Oh, dear.
And there's one family in which the kerosene stove created a fire, and a couple of the kids in my block were killed. And subsequent to that, because of that tragedy, the law was passed in New York City in which all tenement houses had to convert to central heating, and they had to get rid of those coal stoves and kerosene stoves that we all had in our kitchen.
Yes.
And then that was when the law, and that was the reason for that law being changed. Yeah.
At some point, you mentioned earlier, you alluded to this, that you decided that you would follow an education path. Was there a particular person, other than the people that you've mentioned, that helped you make that decision, or that were instrumental in you deciding to follow it?
No, I don't know if there was anybody particular in terms of people. I think it was my observation of the conditions and the situation within which I was.
Was that in college that you made that determination?
In the early fall, I guess in my second or third year. And I started telling you the story where I would still get together. I was still living in 40.
Yes, sure.
Get together with a lot of my friends and people and realize how intelligent they were, but they needed education. And then that's when I made the decision to go into education. And I majored in education about my third year of college.
Okay.
So from that time on, I never thought I wanted to do anything else.
I'm going to ask you first if you can remember the names of some of these guys or some of these friends.
Oh, sure.
But have you kept in touch with them?
Yeah, a few of them, yeah. There's a few of them, as I said, along with us, passed away.
Yes.
But I go back, every once in a while, I go back to New York City. Well, I say every once in a while, about every 2 or 3 months. And I go to my old neighborhood. The neighborhood has changed, but there's still some of the old timers around. And there's a few guys I still run into. And there's one guy particularly.
And they're still there.
They're still there.
Wow.
And there's one guy particularly who we still do. We used to call him Spider in those days. We still call him Spider. Matter of fact, there was something, if you want to know a little bit more about him and something about the neighborhood, there was a book that was published about 10 years ago called the Westies.
Oh, yes.
And it was about an Irish gang, the Featherstones, and a couple others. And I knew them and their family too.
Uh-huh.
But that book describes a few of the people who I grew up with.
Wow.
And Spider's mentioned in there, and his son, who was unfortunately met with tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get to read that kind of a book, you get an idea of some of the people I grew up with. And I knew there's some of the characters in that book. Unfortunately, the bad side. But there was some other people eventually that I've been in touch with who have become very successful, mostly in business, manufacturing business, and a couple other things. So there's a few guys that I still keep in touch with who become very successful.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you were growing up, either as a teenager or earlier, you were only child, but did you have chores that you were responsible to do?
Oh yeah, we were what we call the janitor, you know. So if you recall, I said that they finally converted to central heating.
Yes.
And there was a coal stove down at the basement, out in the cellar. And it was my job to see that that thing was always fired up and everybody had heat in that whole house as far as hot water and the heat is concerned. But with that coal stove, you had to take the ashes out every day. You had to go down and stoke the fire and with the ashes. And 2 or 3 times, I forget now, 2 or 3 times a week, we would have to, I would do it by myself, take the ashes from down the basement and bring it out to the curbside. And it would be these big 20-gallon.
Oh, I remember them. Yeah. Yes.
Garbage pails, and they would be loaded with ashes, and I'd have to schlep them up very safe.
Yeah.
And then I'd have to clean the halls. I'd have to, every Saturday was my job to wash the halls, the floors, and the stairs from the top floor down.
Was this your parents' building then that you were doing?
Yeah, and then eventually they bought that building.
Okay, so you were taking, I can hear the responsibility that you had for all the tenants in the building.
Yeah, and I had to respond to the tenants.
What was your first paying job?
I was there in the newspapers with stationery stores. After I started working with Bertie, what we used to do to get newspapers like the Daily News, and then if you remember, they used to have an outsider and the counter. We used to go down towards what used to be the old Madison Square Garden on 49th Street and 8th Avenue. And the Daily News and Daily Mirror and the Herald Tribune and those papers were there. And they would have trucks and you would purchase all of the newspapers that the stationery store needed. But as I would walk down in that direction from 46th Street to 49th Street, you passed a couple, we used to call them candy stores. And we passed a few candy stores. And then eventually I decided, I think I'll ask each one of them if they want me to do it. So I picked up a route of about 4 or 5 candy stores.
All right.
And I used to get the newspapers for them. And
the entrepreneurial spirit that worked.
It's first entrepreneurial ventures, yeah.
Okay. Now, was there a family holiday that you look forward to? Was there like one holiday during the year that family got together?
Yeah, no, we're very much, we still carry the tradition of Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve is my big day, if you want to call it that, in my family. We all get together in my house, which is a carryover from my own family. And Christmas Eve, we have the traditional thing where you have 7 different kinds of fish.
Yes.
And we sit around on Christmas Eve. We're all there cooking and preparing for this, and it's a great meal. You know, we start maybe about, I don't know, somewhere about 6 o'clock in the evening, and we're still at the dining room table there until 10:30, 11 o'clock that night. We're still cooking and enjoying ourselves.
Yes.
And so we're still doing that. My children still come and visit me every Christmas Eve. And they now bring their children.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
Well, Christmas Eve is the real big event.
So do the kids get their presents on Christmas Eve, or do they have to wait till?
Yeah, no, we give them out on Christmas Eve because then, of course, they return, like my children, go back to their home. Yeah. And then they have their own little thing at their own privacy. But Christmas Eve is when we exchange the gifts among the family, both between the members of the family. So usually there's about 25 people on Christmas Eve.
Wow, what a gang.
Yeah.
Now, you've described pretty much your growing up, but I want to get a clearer picture, if I can, of what your interests were as a kid. What did you do after school, or that? I mean, you've mentioned some things that you did with your friends, hanging out and so on. Was there anything else that? Were you a reader, for example, or were you into sports?
Yeah, I'm a pretty active youngster, really. I was a wild guy, if you want to call it that. You know, as I said, I mentioned to you, I worked a while as a longshoreman.
Yes.
Then in 1947 and 48, I was in the Golden Gloves. I did some boxing in Golden Gloves. I didn't do well, so I didn't pursue that career too well.
But you used to spend a lot of time at the gym.
So I was down. There's a place we used to go on 18th Street in New York called CYO. And I met some very high-profile boxers there. There was one of the first guys I met, I don't know, I'll mention in it, Arturo Godoy, for example, who fought Joe Louis. And he used to train there at the CYO. Tony Zale, who fought Rocky Graciano, he trained there. Artie Levine, he later on retired, he trained there. So there's quite a number of these guys with high profile who did a lot of training there. And I used to train there as well. And
you spar with any of these guys?
I sparred with a kid called Nanutz, who became what was that, welterweight, was that? I think it was a welterweight champ for a while. I sparred with him for a little bit. And he beat the heck out of me, so I didn't spar with him too much.
Yeah.
He was good. He was excellent.
Okay.
But he quit too. He didn't get into, after a while, you know, boxing is a tough sport. Today I don't like it at all, because it's a little bit too violent. I see how violent it is, you know. But when you're young, you know, it's a kind of sport you get into. I guess you get rid of a lot of your frustrations, and whatever anger you have is a good way to get rid of it. And I've learned to release a lot of my frustrations and anger through boxing.
In a controlled way, sure.
It's more or less control. And then, of course, you got to watch, because you can cross over that path if you get provoked. You know, it's very easy to get into a situation. And
this is a change of query here. I'm curious. Are you a night person or a morning person? What do you prefer, getting up early or staying up late?
Well, I think I like getting up late, to tell you the truth. I like to, and lately I guess I go to bed early too. I don't know.
Okay.
But I used to be one of those kind of guys. I'd stay up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and then go to bed. And I'd probably get my best sleep about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. And then you hate to have to get up.
Yes.
But when I used to work here, for example, at the high school, I was up at 5:30.
Yeah.
You know, and I try to be here about 7:30 in the morning.
You can't tell me you were going to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning.
No, I think then I got into the habit of falling asleep watching television, news, the 11 o'clock news and stuff.
That's right. Right. What's your favorite season of the year, if you have one? I know you're not particularly fond of winters these days, but
the winters I don't care for at all, to tell you the truth. I like the fall.
Yeah. Okay.
There's something about the fall. You can see the way, for example, changing of the flora, but there's also something else that comes out in the fall. You know that things will become dormant, and you know that it's a period of rest, and it's a period of even tranquility. Always, however, there's a sense that things are going to renew themselves. They will rejuvenate themselves, and they need this period of relaxation, if you want to call it that, a period to go into dormancy. And the change, not only is it beauty, is it terms an aesthetic quality about it, but there's this kind of change. And I think that almost personifies life in itself.
Yes.
As far as people are concerned, we get to a certain stage and we gotta kind of want to relax a little bit, take it easy. And we're at that point where we need to pull back a little bit. But there's also this idea that things will rejuvenate themselves, whether we do it through our children or whether we're doing it through other ways. But so I kind of see this symbolism, if you want to call it.
there's something very nostalgic about the way you describe those early memories. I wanted to know if there are certain aromas that bring you back to childhood or to to some of the better times in your life. You get a whiff of something and suddenly you're back there.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for any Italian not to say that the aroma of the Sunday morning cooking that your mother had, that as soon as I guess one of the reasons I'm overweight is also because the aroma gets to me more often than once a week nowadays, I guess there's that aroma of my mother doing a Sunday morning cooking,
Okay. Yeah.
that still gets me,
Now, you're a product of New York City public schools.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the first school you
I
attended?
went to a school, the first one I went to was at PS 17, and it was located on 47th Street between 8th and 9th Avenue. And it's still there. I pass by every once in a while. Now I think it's a junior high school. I'm not sure. But
Do you remember your first day there?
oh, yeah. Oh, I remember my first, I didn't even talk about that in the early days. I remember being in kindergarten, and I remember I didn't speak English yet.
Uh-huh.
And I remember being told to move around, and I didn't understand what the teacher was saying. I didn't understand what the other classmates were trying to tell me, and I would just sit and whatever. Their gestures were things I used to follow. I didn't understand what they were saying. So I remember being in
No bilingual
education then. And that's one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of bilingual education, incidentally, even though there may be some people who was, talk about it, where this not supposed to be so in the United States, which I disagree with because, first of all, we're such a pluralistic society. So, but I think that's has influenced me a great deal as to why I'm an advocate of bilingual education. I feel very strongly that, we know that 2 and 2 is 4 no matter what the language is, and the kid can learn that 2 and 2 is 4, whether it be in Japanese or Italian or English or whatever. But you have to be able to communicate with him and be able to get him to understand that 2 and 2 is 4. So there's so many things that kids can learn. And the means or the media for learning these things is through communications, and communication has to be established between two people. So there's mutual understanding, which is really the definition of communication. And the definition of communication is that there is mutual understanding, and if you don't have mutual understanding, then you can't learn these things. And so, eventually, you will learn the language, but there's no reason to have to prolong the inexperience of learning so many other things that there is to learn because of the handicap of not knowing the language where someone can't communicate with you.
There seems to be such a fear on the part of some people today that we're going to lose our somehow our identity if we allow other languages into that.
Well, it's a chauvinistic attitude.
Yes,
and I think, those that were okay back in the late 80s, 1800s rather, and the early 1900s, but chauvinism is pretty much dead. And thank God for
But you can remember kindergarten.
Oh, yeah, I can remember kindergarten. I remember every teacher I had. For some reason or other, I can remember my first grade teacher, second grade teacher. I can remember different experiences in there. I remember my first grade teacher, Mr. Lewis, for example, who tried so hard to teach me to read. And then I remember standing on a line at the end of the year, and I was going to now go into what they used to have 1A and 1B in those days.
Yes.
And I was going to go into 1B now, and there was a Miss Thompson who was going to be my teacher. And I can recall Miss Lewis putting her hand on my shoulder and saying that he tries hard, but he saying something. And I remember Miss Thompson, the reading groups that she had put me into. I remember all those things.
That's fun.
I remember every teacher. I remember situations in every class from the first, second, third grade. I don't know if that's good to remember going way back that far, though.
They say, you've heard it as many times as I have, Chuck, about how a teacher can affect eternity. And those memories are seminal. They stay with you forever and ever and ever. Did you stay in touch with any of the teachers that you had prior to
I did
becoming one yourself?
Well, before I lost touch with him, of course, age factors.
Sure.
But I lost touch with the last teacher that I had experience with, which was a high school teacher, Mr. Kaplan. I lost touch with him when I was doing some graduate work at Columbia University. I did my graduate work at Columbia, and I was the last person I was in touch with. And that fellow, as a matter of fact, his name was Stanley Kaplan. They have this tutoring thing now, Stanley Kaplan. And so he was doing some of that on his side. And I often wondered if this was he was not the founder, if not the same guy. The name of the high school was called Straubing Textile High School. It's now called Charles Evan Hughes High School, which is located on 18th Street, New York. And it was a combined academic, which used to have vocational schools.
Yes.
It was a combined academic vocational school.
In the garment area.
Right. And if you were interested in pursuing anything in the garment industry, you could go to that school. But if you weren't, you can still go on and pursue what they had as either academic or general diploma in those days. Well, I went for the general. It wound up being academic. I initially started with the general.
Yes.
At Straubing Textile High School.
Wow.
And I played a little basketball for them, but I wasn't their first string. I guess I was a little too short for that. I played a little basketball for them for a while. I was pretty good in sports, but
I gathered that. So now you graduate from high school, and you've decided at this point to
right about then I started working as a longshoreman, and I worked down at the docks there for about maybe about a year or so.
Oh, so you didn't go right to school; you went to work after high school.
Yeah, I worked down there as a longshoreman for a while, and then there was an acquaintance, a fellow I met, Don Fisher, and he went to college. He was not really from our neighborhood, but outside our neighborhood. And in those days, as a longshoreman, you used to have to go down and what they call shape up. And every morning you'd have to go before the dock boss, and you'd stand out there, no matter what the weather conditions were, and they would pick. You'd shape up and pick you if there was some work for you. And if you didn't, you went home. And then I used to sometimes go down to, there used to be a union hall for people who used to work on trucks on 34th Street. And you can shape up there too. So if you didn't make it to the docks, you'd run down to the union hall to work on the trucks as a helper to the truck driver. So, but there was one day this fellow came looking for me, and I didn't get a job working the docks or the union hall. He said, take a ride with me, because he was going to LIU.
Oh.
He said, take a ride with me. I have to pick up some papers and stuff like that. All right, I'll go with it. So we went, and it was there while I was waiting for him that somebody said, "What? Can I help you?" I said, "No, I'm waiting for a friend of mine." And the next thing you know, I was filling out an application. And I filled out the application, I left it. And then my friend came, and we came back home, and then it's a very interesting story. That's why I say it. Sometimes life is a series of luck. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, I was coming home, and my mother was hugging me, kissing me, and she was telling me, "Boy, Charlie, what the heck is going on?" She says, "Oh, you're Italian. Oh, for me, squall, which means you're going to go to school." What the heck is she talking about? And what it was a letter from LIU saying I was tentatively accepted. Not even accepted, but just tentatively accepted. And I had to meet certain conditions because I had to fulfill.
Yes.
And I said, I'm not going to college. Don't worry about it. She said, "No, you got to go now." I told her, she told me my hands. Anyway, make a long story, I got put into this box. Now, I said, "Well, yeah, maybe I'll go and I'll give it a shot, give it a try." So I fulfilled the conditions that they wanted, and I went to school. At first year of school, Lawrence University, they were located in Brooklyn. They didn't have a campus there. There were different buildings. Con Ed was a building on Pearl Street in Brooklyn.
Oh, yeah.
And that first year was tough. It was a really tough year because I was not oriented. to
Taking a full load of classes in first year.
yeah, I just wasn't oriented to real schoolwork.
Yes.
Because I never thought about going to college when I was in high school. But I made that first year, and then every year after that, I got a little easier. By the time I got into my fourth year, then things began to really click.
Yes.
Then after that, I was drafted. I went into the service. So I worked for about 6 months as an English teacher.
After your degree.
After I got my degrry, I worked for...
What was your degree in, by the way? What's your
Education.
baccalaureate? Education.
Yeah.
Okay.
With a minor in English literature.
Okay.
So I got a job as an English teacher in New York City. Then I got drafted, and I served in the army. When I came back out, I was still in uniform.
Did you see? This is Korean conflict. You're talking about Korean War. Did you see active duty while you were in service?
I stayed in the States. I was fortunate.
Thank God.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was in 101st Airborne Division. I stayed in. I was an instructor in Kentucky a long while. And I was finally transferred over to Fort J in New York, and then I was released.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being in uniform, and I took a ride out. I was going with some lady friend at that time. Who was it? Just about the time I met my wife. I was dating other different. We took a ride out here, and I said, while I'm out here, and I was in Lindenhurst, I said, while I'm out here, let me go and see if they need any teachers. And I went in, I spoke with a fellow by the name of Bob Little, and he hired me on the spot.
In Lindenhurst?
In Lindenhurst, yeah. And that was as soon as I got my discharge,
Son of a gun.
I started working in Lindenhurst back in 1954.
What grades were you teaching?
I got a job as a 6th grade teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in elementary school. And I taught there in Lindenhurst in the William Rawls School for 3 years or 4, 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fellow I was working for asked me if I wanted to be an assistant principal. And I was sure.
Terrific.
So I went in to become an assistant principal. Then I really started focusing.
Yeah, that required you to go back to school.
That time I went. As soon as I got out of the service, I went back.
Now, you mentioned Columbia. Was that where you decided to?
I did my graduate work at Columbia. Yeah. And I went on, I finished that up, and then I went on for my doctorate. I didn't complete that because then I started raising a family, and I had.
How far did you get in? How far did you get into the doctorate?
All I needed to do was a serve internship.
I'll be darned.
Yeah,
so you did all your.
I had everything done.
Courses. Boy,
I had everything done. I had completed my outline for my dissertation,
which was on what subject?
Believe it or not, it was going to be on comprehensive achievement monitoring, which is a study that was done on what we refer to in Brentwood as the BEST program, Brentwood Educational System for testing. Because I was one of the fellows that introduced that here in Brentwood, and so I was doing my work I was doing a study on comprehensive achievement monitoring.
So you could have had your doctorate, but for the fact that you needed an internship,
and I couldn't afford it because that I wasn't eligible for sabbatical in Brentwood.
That's right.
And I had 4 kids at race.
Yes. Oh, sure. Priorities.
Yeah. So I never went for my internship, and so never did it.
What brought you to Brentwood then? Here you're working now in Lindenhurst. Well, when I became an assistant principal, I gather,
in Lindenhurst, and then I did that for about 6 years as assistant principal, and I felt the time had come that I wanted my own school, my own building, and do the kind of things I felt I'd like to do and try to enhance certain things in education. So while I was at Columbia, there were people that were recruiting. They used to go around recruiting and I went to a couple of those interviews where they had, and I was accepted. I was offered a couple of positions, and I turned a few of them down. And then finally, my advisor, a fellow by the name of Thurston Atkins, Columbia, took me into his. The name of the high school was called Straubermuller Textile High School. It's now called Charles Evan Hughes High School, which is located on 18th Street, New York. and it was a combined academic. We used to have vocational schools.
Yes.
It was a combined academic vocational school.
In the garment area.
Right. And if you were interested in pursuing anything in the garment industry, you could go to that school. But if you weren't, you can still go on and pursue it, what they had as either academic or general diploma in those days. Well, I went for the general. It wound up being academic. I initially started with the general.
Yes.
At R.O.B.S Textile High School.
Wow.
And I played a little basketball for them, but I wasn't their first string. I guess I was a little too short for that. I played a little basketball for them for a while. I was pretty good in sports, but
I gathered that.
Yeah.
So now you graduate from high school, and you've decided at this point to continue.
Right about then, I started working as a longshoreman, and I worked down at the docks there for about maybe about a year or so.
Oh, so you didn't go right to school; you went to work after high school.
Yeah, I worked down there as a longshoreman for a while, and then there was an acquaintance, a fellow I met, Don Fisher, and he went to college. He was not really from our neighborhood, but outside our neighborhood. And in those days, as a longshoreman, you used to have to go down and what they call shape up. And every morning you'd have to go before the dock boss, and you'd stand out there, no matter what the weather conditions were, and they would pick, you'd shape up and pick you if there was some work for you. And if you didn't, you went home. And then I used to sometimes go down to, there used to be a union hall for people who used to work on trucks on 34th Street. And you can shape up there too. So if you didn't make it to the docks, you'd run down to the union hall to work on the trucks as a helper to the truck driver. So, but there was one day this fellow came looking for me, and I didn't get a job working the docks or the union hall. He says, take a ride with me, because he was going to LIU.
Oh.
He take a ride with me. I had to pick up some papers and stuff like that. All right, I'll go with it. So we went, and it was there while I was waiting for him. That somebody said, "What? Can I help?" I said, "No, I'm waiting for a friend of mine." And the next thing you know, I filling out an application, and I filled out the application. I left it, and then my friend came, and we came back home, and then it's a very interesting story. That's why I say it. Sometimes life is a series of luck. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, I was coming home, and my mother was hugging me and kissing me, and she was telling me, boy, she was, what the heck is going on? She says, oh, you're Italian, oh, me, about a squirrel, which means you're going to go to school. What the heck is she talking about? And what it was a letter from LIU saying I was tentatively accepted. Not even accepted, but just tentatively accepted. And I had to meet certain conditions because I had to fulfill.
Yes.
And I said, I'm not going to college. Don't worry about it. She said, no, you got to go. And I told her, and she told me hands and everything. Anyway, like a long story, I got put into this box. Now, I said, yeah, maybe I'll go and I give it a shot, give it a try. So I fulfilled the conditions that they wanted, and I went to school. At first year of school, Florida University. They were located in Brooklyn. They didn't have a campus there. They were different buildings. Con Ed was a building on Pearl Street in Brooklyn.
Oh, yeah.
And that first year was tough. It was a really tough year because I was not oriented to
taking a full load of classes in the first year.
Yeah, I just wasn't oriented to real schoolwork.
Yes.
Because I never thought about going to college when I was in high school. But I made that first year, and then every year after that, I got a little easier. By the time I got into my fourth year, then things began to really click.
Yes.
Then after that, I was drafted. I went into the service. So I worked for about 6 months as an English teacher.
After your degree?
After I got my degrry, I worked for...
What was your degree in, by the way? What's your baccalaureate? Education.
Yeah.
Okay.
With a minor in English literature.
Okay.
So I got a job as an English teacher in New York City. Then I got drafted, and I served in the Army. When I came back out, I was still in uniform.
Did you see? This is Korean conflict. You're talking about Korean War. Did you see active duty while you were
No.
in service?
I stayed in the States. I was fortunate.
Thank God. Okay.
I was in 101st Airborne Division. I stayed in. I was in an instructor in Kentucky for a long while. And I was finally transferred over to Fort J in New York, and then I was released.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being in uniform, and I took a ride out. I was going with some lady friend at that time. Just about the time I met my wife. I was dating other different. We took a ride out here, and I said, while I'm out here, it was in Lindenhurst. I said, while I'm out here, let me go and see if they need any teachers, And I went in, and I spoke with a fellow by the name of Bob Little, and he hired me on the spot.
In Lindenhurst?
In Lindenhurst, yeah. And that was as soon as I got my discharge,
Son of a gun.
I started working in Lindenhurst back in 1954.
What grades were you teaching?
I got a job as a 6th grade teacher in elementary school. And I taught there in Lindenhurst in the William Roll School for 3 years or 3 years. And then the fellow I was working for asked me if I wanted to be an assistant principal. And I was sure.
Terrific.
So I went in to become an assistant principal. Then I really started focusing.
Yeah, that required you to go back to school.
That time I went back. As soon as I got out of service, I went back.
Now, you mentioned Columbia. Was that where you decided to?
I did my graduate work at Columbia. Yeah. And I finished that up, and then I went on for my doctorate. I didn't complete that because then I started raising a family, and I had.
How far did you get into the doctorate?
All I needed to do was a serve internship.
I'll be darned.
Yeah,
so you got all your
done.
Courses? Oh, boy.
I had everything done. I had completed my outline for my dissertation.
Which was on what subject?
Believe it or not, it was going to be on comprehensive achievement monitoring, which is a study that was done on what we refer to in Brentwood as the BEST program, Brentwood Educational System for testing. Because I was one of the fellows that introduced that here, the concept of the dignity of man. If you really believe in the dignity of man, you have to say, go for it, do it. But behind this dignity of man is the idea of going back to Bernie, the candy store operator, is that people are important. They're all equally important. There's no one, really, whether you be the president of the United States or whether you be an unfortunate indigent collecting welfare checks. Each person is as important as the other person is. But so if people are important, we can't forget that students are important people. And I think that point, that students are important people, is probably in the heart of most of the adults that I know of that work here in Brentwood and work with students. They never let go of the idea that these are students, but they are important people. They are people. And each one of them should be treated equally as important. I mean, some kids have hang-up and some kids have all time. Our job in education is not so much to teach them the content or what is in textbooks or whatever. Our job as teachers, and I think you guys might remember my saying this during my tenure here. Job as a teacher is to help children to succeed, students to succeed. That's our job. Now, we have to set up a variety of things to help students to succeed. In some cases, when you take elementary school, you have to set up a breakfast program. Because a breakfast program, unfortunately, is what will help them to succeed. And you have to get down to that kind of level if necessary. But there are much more complex levels than just helping with breakfast program. They're much more complex level. So our job is to help them succeed. One of and to give you a pat on the back, John, one of the things that the Mazel Tov School should very, very well be remembered for, and should everybody applaud, was the idea that even though it was a different style, a different strategy of instruction, basically and fundamentally, it was there to help kids succeed who could not succeed in a traditional way. And that's our job. So we shouldn't be caught up and so rigid that we can't be so inflexible or intransigent that we can't change strategies so the kids can succeed. And that's the job.
You just answered a question that I indirectly put to you before, but I was going to ask it directly now, and I think you've answered it. And that is, outside of your job description, whatever it may have been at the particular time or position you were holding, how did you define your own purpose in education? I think you've just answered that.
That's really what it is.
Yes.
And I think, and to help them to succeed, but to the purpose in life is to go back to what I said earlier, and that is that it liberates them from the chains
Yes, chains
that hold them and tie them down from developing a good quality of life. Success is not measured in terms of wealth. Success is not measured in terms of how well you succeed in a business or how much wealth you can accumulate. That's not how you measure success.
There's Bernie the candy store operator talking again.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, okay. You're right. So it's really the character development. And when we talk about helping students succeed, we're really talking about developing character.
Yeah.
Because you've got the right character, you can succeed no matter what endeavor.
Were you ever active or involved with BIPSO at any time?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was really pretty active. I was on most of their executive committees.
Okay.
I never wanted to become the president because I was too involved in the other things. Mm-hmm. But I was a vice president of BIPSO, and I served all various executive committees at BIPSO.
Let me ask you this, essentially a philosophical question. Has your opinion of unions changed over the years?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Regrettably, in a way, let's put it this way. In the long run, I'm happy for many of the things that they do. I think in the long run, we're no longer considered a second-class profession because the rewards are there now. I mean, the salaries that teachers receive are catching up with where where I think they should be. A lot of the benefits that they're getting, I think, are catching up and maybe even going beyond. But and in the long run, those things will attract much more talented people and probably the upper level of intelligentsia to come in to the field. And that in itself will help the whole educational profession succeed.
Mm.
What I find too often, however, is that perhaps the leadership of many of the unions are more concerned about membership's protection and their members in terms of a right or wrong kind of thing, that they are entitled to be protected because they happen to be union members.
Mm.
And I think that they're a myopic point of view developing here, where they are more concerned about the members than they are concerned about the general educational.
We wouldn't indirectly be talking about tenure here, would we?
No, I'm not even thinking about tenure, because that's a whole ball game in itself.
Yeah.
Because if you really want to examine it, unless laws have changed.
Yes.
But most places where you work, that is particularly big corporations, after you've gone beyond the probationary period, whether you work at the General Electric or whatever the case might be, you have tenure.
Mm-hmm.
Because tenure means, in effect, number one, that you're guaranteed the position unless you are incompetent, and if you are, and there's some charges being brought against you for whatever, it could be not only incompetent, it could be criminal, whatever the case might be, you're entitled to a hearing, okay? And you have a right of appeal. That's what tenure means. So there has to be one specificity of charges, has to be a hearing, and they have to have the right of appeal. Well, you have that in all your jobs, whether you're working for General Electric. You can't just get fired. I mean, because if you've done something wrong, and you can be charged for whatever whoever it is thinks you done something wrong. But there has to be specific charges. And that person is also entitled to a hearing, whether it be with the Department of Labor or whatever the case might be. And that person also has a right of appeal. So we have tenure in the private sector as well as the public sector, and that exists.
Okay.
So I think, but when you talk about tenure, I mean, for people.
What you were talking about, the
No, I think that's
unions.
usually priorities are more, and that's, I think, more and more the priorities are for the benefit of members, right or wrong, and often, I too often that I like to see, at the expense of the whole educational enterprise, particularly at the expense of some of the kids.
Yeah.
And when I see, and that's what I used to do that.
Okay.
And many of the conflicts I had here in Brentwood, particularly with the union, when I had conflicts with them, and I supported them in many ways.
Mhm.
In terms of these benefits we support, I supported them on.
Yes.
But many of the conflicts I had was that I saw political decisions being made.
Politics? You mean it's politics?
And they were educational decisions. Yeah. Political decisions being made, and very often the political decisions being made were at the expense of the kids.
Yeah.
Or the parents, who are also our clients, too. Let's not forget
You bet.
the parents.
Yes. Who are some of the memorable people that you've had to work with in those arenas over the years that made a positive impression on you, that you have that you gain respect for working with? I don't know if it's fair to put you in a position of naming names or whatever. People that you have positive associations with over the
There are different people for different
reasons.
Sure. You know, I mean, as far you take a guy like everybody, talks about Guy. That's just good, right?
Yes.
And even though we in a way, we were personal friends as well. But the guy was a master in terms of politics. Okay, he was a master as far as politics was concerned. He was a master in getting jobs done. I mean, if this is what we decide we're going to do, he was a master of being able to mobilize.
As a social studies teacher and student of Machiavelli,
he was a Machiavellian, no question about it. So he was a master at that. So I admired his cunningness, his ability to be able. But he always had good intentions. He never did it for self-interest. That was one of the things I liked about Guy. There was no self-interest with him. It was done with the interest of the educational enterprise, or the enterprise of schooling. So I had a great admiration for him. There's a generally to be able to do.
I think that went both ways, because I think from my understanding and my experience, he saw in you something of your leadership abilities and some of the value as an educator that I think he brought to the decisions he made where your life was concerned.
Yeah, I hope he did. I think he did, personally. I hope he did. And if anything, I hope that I had the reputation of, I could have been a little tough and a hard master or something, that I had a tremendous value in this whole educational enterprise. I put a lot of value into it. I put a lot of value into what we were doing and doing it with integrity. And I wanted to put a lot of integrity. And one of the things that used to get me upset, as you remember, I had a reputation of even having disagreements, harsh disagreements with some board members. At one point, I had one of them escorted out of the building. I don't know if you remember the story.
I don't.
But, I would become livid and upset, and I would go up even to central office, and I didn't have a good reputation there with them sometimes, because I was so upset when I saw decisions that were made for political reasons rather than for educational reasons. And I would really get very upset. And I let the world know about it. Mm-hmm. And if I had a fault, it was that everybody knew where I was coming from. I never held back what my thoughts were, or my feelings were about something. And I think I had the courage of my convictions too.
Well, to paraphrase, was it Barry Goldwater that said, excess in in the service of education is no vice or whatever.
Good point. Very good.
At some point, you decided enough, I gather, because when did you retire? What was the year?
1990.
Okay, so at some point you came to that fork in the road and you took a look and you made a decision.
Yeah. Well, quite honestly, there were two basic reasons. Okay, in 1990, I got to the point where and I'm not casting aspersion necessarily on any one person,
Mm-hmm.
but I began to realize that I wasn't as effective as I thought I could have been with some of the people who are now that I was working with. And so that I saw a lot of things happening where any of my ideas now were met with a
Resistance, right away.
with resistance, and I was getting a lot of resistance. I'm not talking about unions anymore.
No, I understand.
Or the unions had a good part of it. Very honestly, some of the leadership people. I'm very honest. You know, some of the leadership members of the union had a tremendous amount of influence on some of the people with whom I was working with, and their influence, I think, impacted on them and created some resistance. And so I began to recognize that the 100% efficiency, if there ever was one, was no longer there, and I was meeting resistance. And the resistance was mostly on two levels. One, political nature of things was probably the big item there. And I was getting some bad press release. And the bad press release at this level, and some of the people joining in this level have colored the situation that they would now begin to personalize. And so things were being done on more on a personal nature than they were on more
Professional,
effective and a more objective nature regarding issues. And so, you know, how long can you deal with something like that, you know?
Well, the stress
one.
level starts to climb.
Well,
and your energy begins to run out too.
Well, your disappointments. You say the disappointments begin to increase.
Okay.
And then at that point, as you know, I went through bypass surgery back in 1976. And 1990, about 1989, I began to feel some of the same symptoms that I had earlier.
Yes.
And so I thought that perhaps maybe I better, kind of take it out. So I was concerned that maybe my health would begin. So if I was succeeding in what I thought I could be doing, I probably would have stayed on regardless of the health symptoms. But then the combination of the two, helped me make the decision to pull out. Unfortunately, because 2 years later, I had to go for a second bypass surgery. So in 1992, I had bypass surgery again.
Yeah, so you made the right decision.
So I made the right decision.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure a lot of people were very happy.
Well, they say there's some other kind of a bromide about never trust a person who has no enemies. So in that sense, you're still standing in good company.
I think I got a lot of friends too. I think a lot of people understood where I was coming from, and a lot of people give me a tremendous support. Even to this day, I get people that contact me and one way or another, and they still give me a lot of support.
How many years were you in education?
I started in 1954. I retired in 1990, so we're talking about 36, 37 years completed.
Yeah, that's a pretty good tenure, I'd say.
Yeah, 37.
You remember what you made your first year as a teacher?
$2,700.
In Lyndhurst, right?
In Lyndhurst. $2,700 a year, first year. Then I got a big raise at $3,000 a year after that was $3,300.
What have you been doing since you retired, Chuck?
I'm very active.
Splitting your life between Florida and Long Island.
Yes,
that's for sure.
Yeah, I spent 3-4 months down in Florida. Well, on the different levels, I do artwork now. I do some watercoloring. I do some artwork. I do all the fishing, and I golf. I'm not good at golf, but I try it.
Okay.
I used to be good, but I I guess I've lost the dexterity for it, and I think I've lost the interest too. Not that I was good, but I played fair, I should say. And I'm in the process of writing now.
Are you?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are you writing? Poetry, short stories?
No, shorts, novels, investigative type of thing.
Wonderful. All right.
Yeah. So someday you might see me as an author. I don't know.
Oh, that's wonderful. This is a toughie. Because you've made a lot of good decisions in your life. Are there any decisions, good, bad, or indifferent, that if you had to make over again, you would do differently? Any choices?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't like to answer the kind of question because they're all in retrospect. They can say, so what the hell is
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Where is it going to go? Where is it? You could have, and should have, and would have. I mean, I sold, for example, I had a piece of property on 46th Street, close there, between 9th and 10th there. And I sold it back in 1976 for $40,000. The thing is worth about $2.5–3 million today.
Yes.
Now, I could lament about it.
Yes.
But, the reality of it is, in 1976, that was the best price I could get. I was happy to get that price then.
And that's the context.
And that was it, Right. So, you can go back and say I could have, should have, but
good answer.
Whatever it was,
good answer.
It was the best at the time. Go on, look at the future, and continue.
Fair enough. You've read a lot of books in your life. Is there a particular book that you can point to and say, this is one of the most important books I ever read?
Yeah, I have 2 or 3 that have tremendous influence in my life. One was All Quiet on the Western Front. And coincidentally, I guess this movie picture that's coming out now, the Saving Private Ryan, there's something to say. But anyway, that, number one, it has tremendous influence on me, not so much as anti-war as it is, let's not be led by people, as we found in that book and in many other books that have been written along the same theme. Let's not be led. Let's not become somebody else's commodity. Let's not become exploited. In All Quiet on the Western Front, we saw how the governments exploited their citizens and used their citizens for the self-interest of those who are in certain leadership positions for their own power and whatever the case. So that had tremendous influence to me. So I look at big government. I think big government is necessary, but I look at them very carefully and I wonder what their motives are. And one of the things that I look at anytime there's something that deals with war, I really have to question, no matter who the government is or what the government is, if those people aren't being exploited. I mean, we fight for freedom and we fight for a lot of different things, but I wonder to what extent, how much of it is propaganda, how much is it, and it's exploitation of people. So I'm really anti-war because I think it serves. I mean, when a mother's child is dead, he's dead. That's the end of it. And 100 years from now, you can build a monument. He's dead. He's not here. He's never going to come back. And that mother's going to cry. And for who, for what purpose, and for what end? I don't know. And so that book has a tremendous influence. The other book that has had a tremendous influence to me is Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. This is a play. And there again, it's a question of being exploited. He's a guy who knocked himself out. He's worked. He's done everything he could, and he possibly could. And having been used for the company's use, for the corporate executive's use, and even though he got into a mess with a few things later on, at the end he gets a gold watch. I mean, where's the importance of people again coming back to And there again, he was exploited. So it has, those 2 books have tremendous influence in my life in terms of how people are being used sometimes, how they're being exploited, how they're being used as commodities, whether by government and by the public. I mean, we saw in Death of a Salesman, that salesman was used as a commodity. He was not considered as a human being. So you give him a big watch, I mean, that was all he's worth. There's a value of a watch, So those things have had a tremendous influence. But I think that they validate some of the things that Barry was trying to tell me.
Yeah.
There was a movie also that has an influence on me was called Network.
Oh, yes.
And that influence had a lot of influence on me. I'm not much of a movie goer, but that had it in there again. It was, a situation, I forget the actors in it, where he got out there and he said, I'm tired of all of this. And the public followed him and they put him into the media and he got on broadcasting and he did his thing and everything else. And there was a scene in there where he met the executive of the multinational corporation, and the executive, after talking with him and everything else, said to him, it made him believe that he was God. And here, this guy who was supposed to be leading the public and believing in these things that he talked about said, I have met God. And he's just showed again how people are used, even at that level, where they will use someone to influence other people for self-interest or profit motives, or whatever the case might be. So that movie had a tremendous influence on.
Question I'm not going to ask you, because unless you want to add to it, you've already answered it time and time again here. I like to ask people who their heroes were. You've answered that in many different ways. I hear you saying Bernie is a hero.
In many ways. And I have to say also my father. My father was kind of a guy that would simplify things. He had an ability to take very complex things and simplify them for me and cut through it all and get to the core.
Yes.
And in simple terms, he would express certain things in his way. And
this was a self-educated man.
And a self-educated man. And he told me, he also, even though he was a hard guy himself and he didn't do everything correct legally or otherwise sometimes, but he didn't want his son to fall into that environment. He didn't want his son to get involved with those kinds of things. And he always taught me the kind of things that were morally correct. And my mother had a tremendous influence on me. And I guess those three people, mostly my mother and my father, because
Great.
They were close to me. They showed a lot of love to me, always had something to tell me, always had something to teach me, I learned a lot from
You've had a lot of fun for a lot of years. You enjoyed very much doing what you did.
Oh, yeah.
What are you going to miss, or what have you already missed most about that service?
Yeah, the role I played, the part I had in life, especially in my career, I know that I had an influence on people. And I think I gave them direction and I'm hoping it was in the right direction, for good purposes and for valid reasons. And I missed the idea of being able to be the teacher in that sense. I mean, even though I was administrator and you were management level, I never thought myself as not being a teacher. Right. I was a teacher at a different level. Yes. I had to teach to be teachers, for example, or whatever. I always thought myself as a teacher. Right. Whenever I set out, even when we have administrative meetings, for example, it wasn't just, this kind of thing. It was always like a workshop, I think. And I always presented things and presented ideas and showed illustrations and philosophy. I always brought in a lot of new ideas. I always brought in different research and talked about the things that are new and innovative and what are some of the things that we could do. That was the kind of thing I always did with when I was in high school, especially. And don't forget, at that time, I had an administrator of close to 20-some odd people.
Yeah, wow.
And so that in itself was, have my monthly meetings with them and other kinds of meetings, subcommittee meetings.
Well, the other side of that question, Chuck, is then what are the things that you haven't missed?
Well, it was this kind of political business.
Yes, okay.
I mean,
is there anything? Is there a way that you might answer this one? Something that you would like to have been able to accomplish before you retired that you just weren't able to reach closure on, or you weren't able to accomplish?
Yeah, I really wanted to get Brentwood High School to become much more academically oriented. That was one of the things I tried to do. As you recall, I was pushing a great deal. Well, I mean, we built this center, for example. I wanted to make sure that we had a library that was going to do that. That lecture hall, for example, was going to be an administrative office, and then we changed that, make that a lecture hall. The idea of bringing in people who would have little groups that tie it in with the library kind of thing, and bring guest speakers and whatnot. So I almost forgot what we were saying.
Well,
what were we saying? I was bringing out a point, and I forgot what my point was going to be.
I had asked you. I had asked you if there was anything that you would like to have seen accomplished.
Oh, yeah. So the academic orientation. So that what I wanted to do, I was hoping that is, and I did that. I was pushing a lot for the Science Olympia and all of these other Olympic academic types of things. I was pushing more and more in that direction, rather than to become so oriented in sports and all of that. I mean, it has its place, this thing in sports and athletics and all that, and it does a lot of rah type of thing.
Sure.
But I wanted more in academic. I wanted more people to identify more with the academic kind of thing, because there is where you're going to really.
Well, didn't all of a sudden the state stepped in and said, this is what's going to happen now, and the state has upped the bar?
Yeah, well, they mandated certain kinds of things. They did say that these are going to be our standards.
Yeah.
And so there was movement in the right direction as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But there's a question here of whether you can mandate certain academic kinds of things, or whether you can motivate certain academic orientation of students. And I was hoping that we could do more motivating of students to pursue more in the academic field rather than to mandate. There's a difference, I think.
There sure is.
And I was hoping that maybe Brentwood, even though many of the people at the time, I don't know really what it is now, come from perhaps a lower, I don't say low, but lower socioeconomic level compared to some of the surrounding environments.
True.
That these kids are just as, what I was telling you about kids in 46th Street, are just as intelligent as the kids that might be in perhaps Dix Hills or Half Hollow Hills or Roslyn or any of those kinds of communities. And they're just as intelligent. And if they can just put the value and the orientation in the academic field as those kids could, they could succeed as well and as those kids, and go back to what I said before, become more liberated, have more choices to pursue kinds of things that would improve the quality of their life.
Well, I certainly agree with everything that you just said, and I have a feeling that we have covered an awful lot of territory here in one man's life. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that needs to be said before we conclude? Because we're just about at the end of our journey here.
Yeah, no, I just hope that, that while it's nice to have a nice job and a lot of security goes along with the job, it's nice to have a position that of importance, if you want to call it a responsibility. It's nice to have a certain stature. Let's not get caught up in those things so much and forget what we're really setting out to do, and I think that's what happens too often. And I hope that we begin to get back to some of the basics, which is, work with kids to help them to succeed.
That's what it's about.
Yeah.
Carmine Puleo, thank you.
My pleasure. John?
Enjoy.
I enjoy it. Thank you very much.